The avoidant knows there is something particular about who you are and how you loved and what you brought to their life that they completely failed to recognize while you were there. Something so significant and so rare that its absence is now creating loneliness so profound, it's reshaping how they understand everything about themselves and about love and about what actually matters in life. And this thing they failed to recognize about you isn't something obvious or surface level, but is something deep and fundamental about your character that was operating quietly beneath every interaction you had, beneath every moment of patience you showed them, beneath every time you stayed when leaving would have been justified, beneath every time you chose to love them despite behavior that made loving them genuinely difficult. And they couldn't see it while it was happening, because seeing it would have required them to be present enough, vulnerable enough, self-aware enough to recognize what was being offered to them. And they were too busy defending against the very intimacy you were creating to actually witness the extraordinary nature of what you were giving them. The loneliness they're experiencing now isn't ordinary loneliness of being single or being without relationship. It's specific loneliness that comes from recognizing you had someone who filled a space in your life that you didn't even know existed until that person left and the space became visible through its emptiness. They had warmth they didn't recognize as warmth until it was replaced by cold. They had safety they didn't recognize as safety until every interaction since feels unsafe by comparison. They had someone who genuinely saw them, not the defended version they presented to the world, but the actual wounded person beneath the defenses. And they didn't understand how rare that seeing was until they encountered person after person after person who couldn't see them at all. And the contrast made clear that what you offered was exceptional in ways they were too defended to appreciate. The loneliness is teaching them something they should have learned while you were still there to hear it. You weren't just someone they were in relationship with. You were someone who understood them in ways no one else has understood them, and losing that understanding has created void that nothing else can fill. Because understanding at that depth isn't something that can be replicated or replaced. It can only be recognized, and they're recognizing it now, in its absence, with devastating clarity that came too late to change what they did, while you were present enough to have changed it. The specific things about you that they completely failed to see while you were right in front of them. The avoidant person failed to recognize several profound qualities you possessed that were operating throughout the relationship. Qualities so fundamental to who you are that they shaped every interaction but were invisible to someone too defended to perceive them. Understanding what they missed reveals why your absence creates loneliness nothing else can address. They failed to see that you were the only person in their life who loved them without conditions attached to that love. Everyone else in the avoidance life operates on some form of transactional basis. Friends who need reciprocation to maintain connection. Family who express love alongside expectations. Colleagues who value them based on productivity and performance. You were different. You loved them when they withdrew. You loved them when they went cold. You loved them when they were difficult and inconsistent and emotionally unavailable. Your love wasn't contingent on their behavior being acceptable, or their presence being consistent, or their emotional availability meeting your needs. You loved the person, not the performance, not the version they presented when things were going well, but the actual, complicated, wounded human being who sometimes couldn't show up. This unconditional quality of your love was so rare in their experience that they didn't recognize it as distinct from other forms of loving they'd encountered because they'd never actually experienced unconditional love before. They'd experienced love that was always slightly conditional on something, and your love felt different, but they couldn't identify why until it was gone, and they started noticing how conditional everything else felt by comparison. The loneliness of losing unconditional love is specific. It's not just missing someone, but missing the feeling of being loved without having to earn it, without having to perform, without having to be anything other than exactly who they are, including the parts that are difficult to love. They failed to recognize that you were actively choosing them every single day, despite having every reason not to, and that this daily choice was extraordinary act of devotion they took completely for granted. The avoidant assumed you stayed because you had to, because you were invested enough that leaving felt too difficult, because the sunk cost of relationship kept you present. They didn't understand that you stayed because you chose to, actively, consciously, daily, and that each day you chose them, despite their withdrawal, despite their coldness, despite their inconsistency, was act of courage and commitment that most people would have abandoned long before you did. You chose them on days when their behavior gave you every reason to leave. You chose them on days when your own pain was significant enough that choosing yourself would have been justified and healthy. You chose them despite having full awareness of their patterns and full capacity to walk away. This wasn't weakness or inability to leave. It was deliberate choice to love someone who was making loving them genuinely difficult. And the significance of that choice was completely invisible to them while you were making it, because they interpreted your staying as evidence you couldn't leave rather than as evidence you were choosing to stay. They failed to notice that you were consistently showing up as emotionally healthiest person in their life, while they were treating you as if your emotional health was inconvenience rather than gift. You brought stability to their chaotic internal world. You brought consistency to their environment of emotional unpredictability. You brought genuine care to relationship where they were providing minimal care in return. You were modeling secure attachment, calm responses to their anxiety, warm presence despite their coldness, firm boundaries alongside genuine affection. And they didn't recognize this modeling for what it was, because they were too busy defending against the intimacy it created to appreciate the psychological sophistication it required. Having someone consistently emotionally healthy in your life is a rare gift that most people spend years in therapy trying to develop for themselves, and you were providing it freely through simply being who you are. And they didn't see it, didn't value it, didn't understand what they had, until every relationship since has felt emotionally chaotic, by comparison, because no one else has brought what you brought. They failed to understand that your patience wasn't weakness or inability to enforce boundaries, but was conscious choice to give them time to develop capacity they hadn't yet developed, and that this patience was a specific form of faith in them that no one else extended. Most people who encounter avoidance patterns leave relatively quickly once they recognize the pattern won't change through patience alone. You stayed longer than most. You gave more chances than most. You expressed more understanding than most. This wasn't because you lacked self-respect or couldn't enforce boundaries. It was because you saw something in them worth waiting for, saw potential for growth that justified your continued investment, believed they could become the partner they were capable of being if given enough time and enough safety. This faith in their potential, this belief that they could grow into capacity for healthy love, was a specific form of gift that required you to see them not just as they were, but as they could become. They didn't recognize this faith while you were extending it. They interpreted your patience as evidence you were okay with their behavior, when actually you were extending patience because you believed in a version of them that hadn't yet fully emerged. They failed to notice that you were creating the only environment in their life where they felt genuinely safe to be themselves, including the wounded parts they hide from everyone else, and that this safety was a result of specific qualities you possessed that they weren't consciously appreciating. You never shamed them for their patterns. You never made them feel broken or defective for struggling with intimacy. You never responded to their withdrawal with anger that would have confirmed their belief that vulnerability leads to punishment. You responded with understanding, with compassion, with continued presence, creating environment where their wounds could exist without being weaponized against them. This safety was so fundamental to their experience with you that they couldn't distinguish it from relationship itself, couldn't see it as specific quality you were creating through your particular way of being, couldn't recognize that removing you would mean removing the safety rather than just removing the relationship. The loneliness they experience now is partly loneliness of being unsafe, of existing in a world where every interaction feels slightly threatening compared to the complete safety you provided. They failed to recognize that your ability to love them, despite knowing exactly what they were doing, despite seeing their patterns clearly, despite understanding their defensive behaviors, despite knowing they were being hurt by those patterns, was extraordinary form of emotional sophistication that most people simply don't possess. Loving someone while clearly seeing their dysfunction requires specific psychological capacity, ability to hold compassion alongside honesty, ability to maintain love while maintaining boundaries, ability to see someone's wounds without being consumed by them or by pity for them. You possessed this capacity and you exercised it consistently throughout relationship, and the avoidant didn't appreciate it because they didn't understand how rare it is. Most people either love blindly, ignoring dysfunction until it becomes unbearable, or they see dysfunction clearly and stop loving. You did neither. You saw clearly and loved anyway, and this combination was so unusual that they didn't have framework to recognize its significance while it was happening. They failed to notice that every time they withdrew and you didn't fall apart, every time they went cold and you maintained your equilibrium, every time they created distance and you didn't desperately pursue them, you were demonstrating strength they were desperately attracted to but couldn't acknowledge, because acknowledging it would have meant confronting why they kept pushing away the very strength that made them feel most alive and most safe. Your strength in the face of their patterns wasn't something they consciously appreciated while experiencing it. It was something that operated beneath their awareness, something that created the specific quality of attraction they felt toward you that was different from attraction they felt toward anyone else. The attraction wasn't just about how you looked or how you made them feel in good moments. It was about who you were in difficult moments, and they didn't understand the source of their attraction until you were gone, and no one else created it, and they realized the attraction was specifically tied to qualities they failed to appreciate while you were demonstrating them. Why? The loneliness they're experiencing now is different from any loneliness they've known before. The loneliness the avoidant is experiencing in your absence isn't the loneliness they felt before. It's qualitatively different, deeper, more disorienting, and more difficult to manage than any previous experience of being alone. Understanding why this loneliness is unique reveals what specifically about you created connection that nothing else can replicate. This loneliness is different because it's loneliness of being seen versus loneliness of simply being alone. They've been alone before, after previous relationships, during periods of chosen isolation, in moments within relationships where emotional connection wasn't present. But those experiences of aloneness were loneliness of lacking company, of not having someone present. This loneliness is different. It's loneliness of having been genuinely seen by another human being and then losing that seeing. You saw them. Not the surface version, not the defended version, not the version they carefully constructed for public consumption. You saw the actual person beneath all of that, the wounded, scared person who wanted to be loved but didn't know how to let love in. Being seen at that depth and then losing the person who saw you creates specific loneliness that can't be addressed by simply having other people around, because other people aren't seeing them the way you saw them. They're surrounded by people, friends, family, colleagues, and they're lonelier than they've ever been because none of those people see them. And the contrast between being seen and not being seen is more painful than simply never having been seen at all. This loneliness is different because it's loneliness accompanied by guilt, making every moment of missing you contaminated by awareness that they're the reason you're gone. Previous loneliness was clean. It was simply absence of connection that felt painful but carried no responsibility. This loneliness is dirty. It's absence of connection that they created through their own choices, that they could have prevented if they'd been willing to face their fears, that exists specifically because they chose withdrawal over presence repeatedly, until the person they withdrew from finally stopped being available to withdraw from. Every moment they feel lonely now is accompanied by recognition that this loneliness is self-inflicted, that they had antidote to this loneliness in their hands, and they systematically destroyed it. And this guilt makes the loneliness heavier and more difficult to bear because there's no external force to blame, no circumstance to point to, no narrative where they're victim rather than architect of their own suffering. This loneliness is different because it's loneliness that reveals how empty their defended life actually is beneath the surface of activity and social connection. The avoidant has always maintained appearance of full life, friends, activities, interests, social engagements. This appearance of fullness allowed them to believe they didn't need deep, intimate connection because their life was already sufficiently rich. But losing you has revealed this fullness as shallow. All the activities and connections and engagements were filling time, but weren't filling the specific space that deep, intimate connection fills. Their life looks full from outside and feels profoundly empty from inside, and this gap between appearance and experience is disorienting because it challenges the entire narrative they've built about being a self-sufficient person who doesn't need romantic partnership to feel complete. They need it. They need what you specifically provided. And recognizing this need after spending years defending against it creates loneliness that's inseparable from identity crisis. This loneliness is different because it's loneliness that intensifies rather than diminishes with time, growing sharper as clarity about what they lost increases rather than fading as memories become less vivid. Normal loneliness after relationship typically softens over time. The pain becomes less acute, memories become less sharp, the person begins to heal and move forward. But this loneliness is doing opposite. It's intensifying as time passes, because time is providing clarity that wasn't available in the immediate aftermath. The longer they go without finding anyone who creates what you created, the sharper the recognition becomes that what they had was irreplaceable. The longer they live with the consequences of their choices, the more clearly they see exactly what those choices cost them. Time isn't healing this wound. It's revealing its full depth, which was obscured initially by the shock and denial and defensive narratives that followed the relationship ending. This loneliness is different because it exists alongside regret in ways that create specific psychological torture where they can see exactly what would cure the loneliness, you, and know simultaneously that they destroyed the possibility of that cure through their own behavior. The loneliness has identifiable solution. They know exactly what would fill the void: your presence, your seeing, your love, your patience, your warmth. The solution is perfectly clear, and the solution is simultaneously impossible because they destroyed it. This combination of clear solution and impossible access to that solution creates specific form of suffering that's different from loneliness, where the solution is unknown, or where hope for future connection remains genuinely open. They know what they need. They know they can't have it. They know they're the reason they can't have it. This triple recognition makes the loneliness feel permanently inescapable in ways that previous experiences of being alone never felt. This loneliness is different because it's teaching them something about themselves. They've spent their entire life avoiding learning that they need another person to feel fully alive, that independence was never actually preference, but was always defense, that the self-sufficient identity they've maintained was a elaborate story they told themselves to justify not doing the vulnerable work that real intimacy requires. The loneliness is stripping away their most fundamental defense, the belief that they don't need anyone, and replacing it with painful truth that they do need someone, specifically need the kind of someone you were, and recognizing this need after defending against it for years creates disorientation so profound it affects how they understand everything about their life, their choices, and who they actually are beneath the person they've been performing as. What this loneliness is actually teaching them, and whether it will lead to any real change. The loneliness the avoidant is experiencing is functioning as teacher, delivering lessons they've been avoiding for years through the only method that could penetrate their defenses, the removal of the thing they failed to appreciate until it was gone. Understanding what this loneliness is teaching them reveals whether their suffering has potential to create meaningful transformation. The loneliness is teaching them that vulnerability isn't the danger they believed it was, that the risk they spent their entire life avoiding was actually the pathway to the fulfillment they desperately wanted but couldn't access, because accessing it required exactly the vulnerability they feared. Every day they experience this loneliness, they're experiencing proof that the defended life they chose, the life of maintained independence and controlled distance and managed intimacy, was actually the dangerous choice, not the vulnerable one. The dangerous choice was staying defended, because defended life leads to exactly where they are now, alone, lonely, recognizing too late that the fear that drove every choice was protecting them from nothing while preventing them from everything. The vulnerability they feared wasn't going to destroy them. It was going to give them everything they wanted. And choosing to avoid it didn't protect them, but permanently cost them what they most needed. The loneliness is teaching them that other people cannot fill the space that specific people create, that relationships aren't interchangeable, and that the idea of simply finding someone new to replace what was lost is fundamentally misguided. They've likely tried, consciously or unconsciously, to find someone who creates similar feeling, similar depth, similar sense of being understood. And every attempt has failed because you weren't replaceable. The lesson the loneliness is delivering is that certain connections are singular. They exist once. They're created by specific combination of two specific people, and they cannot be manufactured or replicated through finding someone with similar qualities. You were a specific person who created specific experience that no other specific person will create in exactly the same way. This lesson is painful, but is also important because it reveals that what they had with you wasn't ordinary. It was extraordinary. And extraordinary things deserve to be treated as extraordinary, rather than as disposable. The loneliness is teaching them that the defensive patterns they relied on to feel safe are actually creating the most dangerous situation they could be in. A life without genuine connection, without being truly known, without the specific warmth and safety that deep intimacy provides. Safety isn't found in defended isolation. Safety is found in being known by someone who accepts you completely, in being loved without conditions, in being seen without judgment. The loneliness is showing them that their defenses didn't create safety. They created prison, and the prison is exactly as lonely as they always feared. Intimacy would be suffocating. They traded one form of suffering, vulnerability, for another form of suffering, isolation. And the isolation is proving far more painful than vulnerability ever was or would have been. The loneliness is teaching them that regret is more painful than fear ever was. that the fear of intimacy they spent years managing and defending against was less painful than the regret of having destroyed intimacy through their defense against it. They feared vulnerability. They feared being hurt. They feared losing themselves in relationship. They feared being trapped. None of these fears materialized in devastating way. The relationship with you was actually good, actually safe, actually fulfilling in ways their fears told them it would never be. But the regret of destroying that relationship through fear that turned out to be unfounded, is devastating in ways the fears themselves never were. The fear was manageable. The regret is crushing. And this comparison between the manageable fear they ran from and the crushing regret they ran into reveals that their fear-based decision-making created worse outcome than facing the fear ever would have. Whether this loneliness leads to real change depends entirely on whether they choose to use the pain as catalyst for therapeutic work or whether they allow it to deepen their existing defenses further. Pain can go either direction. It can crack open the defended person enough that they become willing to do work they previously refused, or it can confirm their belief that relationships lead to suffering and make them defend even more intensely against future vulnerability. The loneliness is providing information and creating pressure, but it cannot force change. Only their choice to respond to pain through growth rather than through greater defense can determine whether this suffering serves any purpose beyond teaching them what they lost. Some avoidants use this exact pain as catalyst. They recognize the loneliness is direct consequence of their patterns, and they enter therapy, do the work, develop capacity they previously lacked. Others use this pain as confirmation that love is dangerous, and they retreat further into isolation. Which path they choose is entirely beyond your control and entirely their responsibility. What their loneliness and their belated recognition of you actually means for you right now. The avoidant's current loneliness and their dawning understanding of what you actually were to them has specific implications for how you navigate your own present experience. Understanding what their suffering means for you helps you make peace with situations that might otherwise feel unresolved. Their loneliness confirms that what you felt wasn't one-sided. The depth you experienced was mutual, even when their behavior didn't communicate this. And knowing this serves your healing by validating experience you might have questioned. You spent time wondering whether you imagined the depth, whether connection was as significant as it felt, whether your investment was matched by genuine feeling on their part. Their current loneliness answers this definitively. Yes, it was mutual. Yes, it was significant. Yes, they felt what you felt, even when they couldn't express it or sustain it. This confirmation doesn't eliminate your pain, but it does eliminate the specific pain of wondering whether you were alone in what you felt. You weren't. They felt it too. They just couldn't hold it. Their loneliness means you should not wait for them to use their pain productively before you move forward with your own life. Their suffering is their journey. Their potential growth is their responsibility. Your healing and your future don't depend on whether they learn from this pain or whether they use it to change. Move forward. Build the life you deserve. Find the love that doesn't require you to accept treatment that creates this level of devastation when it ends. Their loneliness is theirs to navigate. Your peace is yours to create. And creating your peace doesn't require waiting to see what they do with theirs. Their belated recognition of you means that the most powerful statement you can make, not to them, but to yourself and to your own future, is simply continuing to be exactly who you are. Because who you are is the thing they failed to recognize, and the thing whose absence is destroying them. You don't need to change. You don't need to become different, or better, or more. The person you were in that relationship, the patient, seeing, loving, boundary maintaining, emotionally sophisticated person. That person was extraordinary and continues to be extraordinary and will be extraordinary in every future relationship. Their failure to recognize your extraordinariness while you are present doesn't diminish it. It only reveals the limitation of their perception, not the limitation of your worth. Continue being who you are. The right person will see it immediately. The right person won't need loneliness to teach them what you're worth. The right person will recognize your value in real time rather than in retrospect. And that recognition, immediate, present, alive, is what you deserve and what's waiting for you when you're ready to receive it. Their loneliness ultimately means the most healing thing isn't anything related to them, but is the quiet, confident knowledge that you were seen, maybe not by them in the way they should have seen you, but by yourself, by this understanding, by the clarity that what you offered was rare and valuable and worthy of someone who can recognize it while it's being offered rather than only after it's been destroyed. You know what you are now. You know what you brought. You know what they failed to see. And this knowledge, independent of whether they ever fully understand it, independent of whether their loneliness ever leads to growth, independent of whether they ever reach out or acknowledge what they lost. This knowledge is yours permanently. They're lonely now. They're beginning to understand what they never realized about you. But you already knew. You always knew. And knowing your own worth while someone else is desperately trying to understand it in retrospect is the most powerful position you could possibly occupy. Not because it gives you power over them, but because it gives you complete power over yourself, over your future, over the choices you make about who gets access to the extraordinary person you are and who doesn't. They failed to see you. Now they're seeing you in absence. But you saw yourself all along, and that self-seeing is the foundation everything else is built on. Every future relationship, every boundary you enforce, every choice you make about who deserves to love you and who doesn't. You were always extraordinary. They're only now beginning to realize it, but you knew, and that knowing is everything.